Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another exciting edition of IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Vaughn Smith, and this is our Cisco Cloud Fundamentals series. And in this episode, we are going to take a closer look at the Cisco UCS management component. And here is Mr. Ronnie Wong to help us again. How are you?
I am doing fine, Vaughn. Thank you again for joining us as we continue on taking a look at the idea here of cloud compute. We are now talking about the second part of really when we talked about the introduction to the UCS components themselves. Vaughn, in that last episode, we went over quite a bit of hardware, okay? And you saw that it's actually more complex than just saying, oh, I'm going to set up a server and have it connect to network. There's a lot of different components that are in there, okay? And Vaughn, after a while, when I started actually mentioning like the numbers and the letters and stuff like that, it can make a head spin, okay? The great thing about that, Vaughn, is that once all that stuff is set up, more than likely probably not going to be by you and me at the beginning, right? As we're just essentially in the associate level of understanding. Now, don't get me wrong, you can be thrown into that very easily, okay? But at the same time, if somebody else is actually doing this, if they've paid quite a bit of money, more than likely they might have also paid for somebody to make sure that it's actually set up, and then you're just really managing it. But you do need to know the components, and that's why we also went over the actual components that we did. But Vaughn, the great thing about cloud computing and the great thing about the Cisco UCS is that instead of us really having to focus in on all the hardware in terms of managing it on a day-to-day basis, okay, of trying to make sure that all the components are actually necessary, and to do all that, we don't have to actually figure out the way that all the hardware really works together once it's cabled together and once it's done that way. You and I, though, can actually use, well, a software interface to do so. And Vaughn, when we start talking about that, especially in terms of the way that cloud computing ends up working, it also means that what they do with that is that they hide the complexity of the underlying technology, like in the episode that we just went through, okay? So that means that we have to understand the benefits of what the UCS actually does for us, and that is in terms of management.
And we learned that it lives on the fabric interconnect area of that topology that we're looking at, not the server and not in the cloud, because you got me on that one. I was like,
understandable.
What?
Like I said, sometimes my questions are relatively vague. So
and then you plug it into a power too.
Yeah,
right?
You got to plug some power into stuff as well. But overall, though, remember that we have essentially a server of some sort, whether it's rack mounted or have a blade server. We also have that Nexus 9000 that really connects us into, of course, our network, that we're actually connecting, our production network. But in between that, we have the fiber interconnect that allows us to connect our servers to that. And then from that point, if we wanted to add in like a storage unit or a SAN of some sort, we would also connect that to the interconnect as well. And the interconnect part is important, Vaughn, because of exactly what you said. When it comes down to managing the UCS, when we connect to it, okay, we're actually connecting to the fiber interconnect itself, okay? So that's actually really important in what we're actually talking about here, okay? But the UCS management itself gives us some different things that we want to actually understand and know, okay? So what it allows us to do, instead of having to manage every individual little piece and component, Vaughn, is it allows me through software to come up with what we call a policy-based automation, and even some of the services that are there to ensure that we also have role-based access service, okay? And all that sounds fancy, sounds a little bit technical, but what it really means for us, Vaughn, is that if I have, let's say, instead of one server, which I tried to break it down to the very minimum that we would do, okay? But what if I had 16 of those things, Vaughn? Imagine having to manage 16 of those different ones. And imagine having to actually say, well, these are the configurations that need to be on all 16, but they can't all be identical. I need different IP addresses on some. I need to make sure that they do this, that some of them do that. Well, the idea of setting up a policy allows me to actually be able to create it one time, then have that policy applied across to the different types of fabrics that we have available to us. So that's why it's actually important in terms of the UCS management, because now we're getting in the software side, and we're going to take a look at the software components as well, okay? The other thing that makes this much more bearable, and the way that Cisco calls it out, and they say is DevOps friendly. Okay, now what do we mean by DevOps friendly here? Okay, every single piece, at least in the Cisco UCS system, if you're actually doing all Cisco equipment, which you pretty much are, okay, every single piece of infrastructure is actually treated as if it's code. So, Vaughn, even though it's hardware, the configuration of it can be where I go into it through the command line, okay, just like I do with just about every other Cisco equipment. But I can also, with programming experience a little bit, be able to realize something that the UCS itself, even though it actually knows that the hardware is there, it treats it as if it's code. So that means it can manipulate the code and actually have that applied and configure all those devices as if it's software.
And like you said, with some coding knowledge, you could go in there and really tweak it at the, I would call it like the base
Yeah, the
level.
programming level.
Yeah, and that
Sure.
way, if you can click buttons, and
Mhm.
those are like nice, ready to go, kind of pre-configured things, but to really get under the hood, you can go to that level, which is always a nice thing as a programmer because you can always tweak the code.
Yeah, and it's a nice thing even for the administrative side of things. Okay, the sysadmins, and the reason why is that if we can learn a little bit of that, it now means we don't have to go, like I said here, to 16 different servers. We don't have to go to 20 different environments to actually configure the same coding here. We can actually programmatically do it. Okay, because of the way that things are actually working together inside of the Cisco UCS system, and we can actually program it and say, hey, I don't have to actually explain to you every single detail. Programming allows me to connect and to communicate with all those different services and tell it, yeah, apply your IP address, bring up this many VICs if I need to, do all this stuff that we need to. In other words, perform the automation that needs to be done. We're just using a descriptive language instead of a prescriptive one that requires us to code in every little detail behind it. Okay, so the idea here of it being DevOps friendly is actually very much the reason why Cisco is actually pushing this as well. Okay, is that they actually believe that the future of everything that we've been doing and learning about in terms of networking can also be handled through network automation, software-defined networking, and even into programmability. And so, this particular aspect of the hardware and the software that they bring together kind of merges that environment in that DevOps world that everybody likes to talk about too. Okay. The other thing that it does is that the way that this is done, okay, it's based on a model type of approach, but it's a day by day approach. And what that means is instead of actually just configuring it one time, Vaughn, okay, it means that it actually takes a look at it day by day and kind of can massage it to ensure that we don't get what we call drift. Okay. And the idea of configuration drift is that some things change over time just because multiple people are, working on it or they change or tweak something else in the background. Well, the Cisco UCS can actually see those things and be able to help us to manage the idea of that configuration drift away from what its original programming was to actually be. Okay. So the overall, though, benefits in terms of operational benefits for us is that it really does help us to reduce costs because now we're not sending people to actually touch every single device that they have to configure, but it streamlines the overall operations of what we do and helps us to ensure that we can actually do high utilization, okay, of our devices and helps us to automate, which means, well, the idea here of actually wasting less time trying to figure out some of the things that need to be done. If I programmatically can say, here's the devices I need to configure, and then I go to Vaughn and go, Vaughn, where is this particular device? And Vaughn looks at me and goes, I don't know. I haven't touched that device in 6 months. I don't know if it's actually exactly configured the way it needs to be or that. Well, all this can be handled through the UCS itself. Now, what we want to understand is as many as there's actually the hardware components, right? We have the Nexus 9000 connecting us to our LAN, okay, and the hardware side. We have the Fabric Interconnect in which we would connect the LAN to, okay? And then with the Fiber Interconnect, we would also connect that to our servers, whether they're actually blade servers, whether they're rack-mounted servers, and also SANs, and we actually connect them. And of course, we can even connect other fiber interconnects in between, okay? Now, all of those are actually managed through two different components, and it really depends on the scale that you need, okay? And so those two components in the software side of it, like the hardware side, there's actually two different components. One is called the UCS Manager, and the other one is called UCS Central, okay? So when all this is configured, remember that when you're connecting into that fiber interconnect is what you're doing. So let me show you my screen here as we get started, and this will help us out, okay? So inside of my lab environment, you actually end up seeing that I have a couple of different bookmarks that have already been created for us. I'm simply going to launch up the UCS Central, which is right here first. Okay, and that's going to get me into the login interface. Now, the UCS Central is actually quite an amazing piece of software. And the other one that's behind this, let me see if I can launch this up in a new tab as well, is the UCS Manager. Okay, the UCS Manager, what normally happens here is that we have an individual manager for the site that we're actually in. Okay, and that means it can manage one location or one particular instance of what we're doing. You might actually be able to even think about it as a single fabric if you want to even go to that particular idea. But this is the basic heart of the management side of the UCS system. Okay, hardware and software. If we want to interact with it and do all the configuration and have it actually centrally managed, we're going to use the UCS Manager. Okay, but this is really for that single environment that we're talking about. So in this one, if I click Launch UCS Manager here, okay, and it's actually going to launch up. Now, I'm using an emulator here, okay, and this is part of the actual demonstration, but this emulator is actually available to you that you can download and be able to actually set up. Now, when I say that, right, it does take a little bit of time getting used to, but you can actually do this without having to go through an actual setup environment like what I'm actually showing you here, okay? So it can be done, but it does take a little bit of time and knowledge to be able to do so, okay? So this particular environment that I'm using is one that's available to Cisco customers that have actually purchased Cisco equipment before. It gives me access to be able to demonstrate some of the things that we want to talk about here. I'm going to log into the actual UCS Manager. I'm also going to do the same thing to the UCS Central here, if I can remember to type in the password correctly, just so that we have them both up and ready to go. All right, Vaughn, so here I am inside of the UCS Manager itself. We just want to go over a few of the different things in the interface, and then we'll come back here and we'll take a look at a little bit more detail after going over the UCS Central itself. All right, Vaughn, so unlike my beautiful, beautiful topology that I drew out here, okay, notice this here, and I can't move the devices. It's really, really tiny, isn't it?
That yeah, I'm like, is that actual text under there?
Yeah, that actually says, I know it's hard to read, fiber interconnect is what it actually says.
Oh, wow.
It tells you primary, and then the other one here says, of course, secondary subordinate, okay? And down here at the bottom, these two little devices, okay, you have a chassis, which of course would be for your blade chassis, okay? So it does say chassis, I know it's hard to see. And the other one here says, oops, let me see if I can scroll that up a little bit more, okay? The other one here says server 1, which is probably a rack-mounted server, okay? So you see that both of them can be used in a single system together if you need to. But notice again, the fabric interconnect is always deployed in pairs. And that also means that we're connecting out to, well, our Nexus 9000s or whatever it is that we're connecting to out here, which is the rest of the network, okay? So this right here is actually what we can manage inside of the UCS Manager. So this is what we can see. We don't have access to any of the other ones that are out there, but Vaughn, this essentially is my environment for this UCS Manager, okay? Now, when I see that over here on the left-hand side, you can see the string of equipment that I have access to, okay? So I have access to that chassis. There's even two different chassis that are down there, but the only one that I have right now is actually that one chassis that we were able to see. There's some rack mounts here. There's also that fabric extender, additional servers here. Let me expand that out for a moment, okay? And notice that there's server 1, and it even gives me a little bit of an icon here, and that's just telling me that there's something, you know, that there's some notification on it, which is fine. And then there's those two fabric interconnects, okay? So right now, Vaughn, as I'm connecting to the UCS itself, I'm inside of the UCM, okay, for this particular fabric, and I'm connecting to one of these two fabrics is what I'm actually connecting to right here, okay, these interconnects. Notice I can actually see the hardware components behind them. The power supply units, fixed modules that have actually been installed, even the fans I can actually see and be able to actually control stuff like that as well. If I go to the fabric interconnects themselves, it actually shows me the same things over here, but in terms of a little bit more details. Remember, Vaughn, that I actually talked about there's normally 3 groups of ports that we worry about, but here they actually only show 2 that are actually in use, Ethernet ports and even the fiber channel ports as well. Remember the other one were what we called universal ports too, okay? So you can see all that stuff if you actually get into it. And with the servers here, Vaughn, I don't know if I can expand this out anymore. Let's see. Oh, there we go, okay? So with the servers, you can see that this is a blade server, and here's all the actual servers that it's actually connecting to. You see where it actually goes 1 through 8. Remember I showed you 8 different slots that are in there? And then they had server 1 and 2. In other words, they have another chassis that has just 2 of the blade servers in there if we actually need to. And I can even see, let's say, here is the actual chassis. No, chassis ID is there. I'm trying to see if I can find the model. There we go. Let's see which model this one is. There is B200. Ironic that, in my diagrams, I actually showed you the B200 as well. So you can see all that information. You can even check out whether it's too hot. There's the thermals behind it. Whether it's been decommissioned. Any firmware updates that are actually needed and what's actually going on. So this one has, looks like version 3.12e, and this is because it's emulated. Okay, so that's what we're actually having. That's the E at the end there. And of course, even additional policies that are out there and available for us and what it can actually do. Okay. Now, there's a lot more to this configuration, Vaughn, that we can actually talk about, but we're only going to take a look at a few other things here. So over on the left-hand side, notice I can actually go directly into the individual servers, into the actual LAN itself, and see how all those things can be applied and managed. If I have a SAN, and notice the SAN here is following the same thing in terms of each of the fiber interconnects. Fabric A and Fabric B, that's how they're normally actually described. One interconnect is Fabric A, one interconnect is Fabric B. VMs that might be running, and you can see if there's actually any that are there. Additional storage, profiles and policies, chassis, you name it. This gives you a single point of view, and if you're in a small network, this may be all that you ever need, okay? So here, Vaughn, it actually gives us access to everything that we would normally have to manage as well from the administrative side of things, okay? So we're not really trying to get too technically in-depth in everything. For those of you that want to learn more about this, make sure you go on and check out, of course, with the Cisco Cloud, there's actually going to be, of course, the cloud admin side of things. So make sure you check that out and you actually get more of a deep dive into that, okay? Now, Vaughn, what if I have more than this original environment that we actually had here, okay? So what if I need to actually be able to manage more? Does that mean I need to actually create, multiple UCSMs here, managers? So here's one for 1, 2, 3, and 4 different environments, okay? They all look identical, Vaughn. If I were to open up each one of them, they would almost seem exactly identical, okay? So Vaughn, how do I actually keep them from being confused? See, that's the key, right? Is if I have 4 of these and I have them opened up here as tabs across the top, how the heck do I keep them separate and not realize, like, if I'm configuring one, is it going to interact and actually mess up the other one? Harder, right? So this is like trying to juggle like 4 different balls and just have different shades. And when you do that, right, and I say, Vaughn, I want you to pick out this gradient of red for me if I have 4 different red balls, and Vaughn's having to juggle it at the same time, okay? It becomes a little bit more challenging, right? Yeah. So if it's a little bit more challenging, the great thing is they have another product that's called, of course, the UCS Central. The UCS Central is exactly like it sounds. It's for centralized administration of multiple managers. Make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. So
it's like the director.
it is almost, except that the director is actually a product in the Cisco line. That yeah,
they actually use that name?
yeah, they actually have a director. So yeah, we don't want to confuse that particular terminology.
I was using like maybe infrastructure of people. You know, you have managers, and then those managers report to the director. Like there's the director of sales, and then you have sales managers. So
Yeah.
I was thinking more along the lines of like HR.
Yeah. So, but here, this is actually, again, for centralized management. So notice you still see some of the same things. There's equipment, okay? So I can still see that, but we normally don't work with it at this level because sometimes when you actually try to do that centrally, it takes a long time. But we tend to work with what we call domains instead. And notice now, Vaughn, each of those domains are just listed right here. 2, 3, and 4. I don't know what I did with domain 1. It's hidden somewhere for one reason or another. Okay, let me see if I actually select. Nope, it's not found there. I was wondering if it just wasn't grouped. But all that stuff is actually right here where we can actually do a little bit more configuration. But the key component to just about everything that we do is located here. Okay, what we call service profiles. Okay, service profiles is essentially the muscle to make everything work the way that we need to. It doesn't matter which particular domain that they're in, but if I want to, there's actually 2 different ways to do this. Up here at the top, they recommend you using the search elements. Now, this is one of the first products where I said, Use the search. Are you joking? Nobody ever recommends this because searches are normally terrible in these things. But here, notice they actually ask you, like, what is it are you looking for? And then they give you this nice little handy thing that drops it down and gives you, of course, even submenus to help you actually understand what you're looking for. But over on the right-hand side, a little bit more, notice that they even go into specific tasks about what you want to do. Okay, so here I can actually type in create service, and now notice I can create a service profile template, or I can create a profile from a template. I can even create one without a template if I wanted to. So if I select something like this, now it gives me, of course, this ability, and it shows me the steps that it goes through. Okay, how does it actually work out? Where does it actually begin? Here's the service profile that we're creating. Here's a policy. It begins up here at the root, and then it can actually distribute it to where it needs to go. And let me see if I can show you that. So it can come over here to HR. It can skip the entire IT department and only be located in one of the teams if I want it to, as far as policy 1 goes. So we can continue to actually have that work out in that way as you want to actually configure it even more. We can, of course, even switch to views and go from the basic overall idea to seeing how it actually applies to different servers and pools of servers. So that way you can group all these together regardless of what particular domain that they're actually all in. So I want to make sure I get out of that. Yes, I want to cancel. Okay. So there's a lot of different environments here that we can actually kind of try to jump into. I'm trying to see if there's actually anything else that I want to really kind of get into. Vaughn, believe it or not, it's hard for me to actually just not take you through like a lot of different things and start to configure it. But then once I do that, waiting for it, though, is actually what takes a little bit more time. Okay. So sometimes if you don't want to wait, you can't start something like that to help you out. Okay.
And so the central, this USC.
UCS.
Yes, man, I am just all over the place. This is the place that you're going to go to normally, and then that manages the managers.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Essentially, it really does actually give you a whole view of everything that is possibly underneath your control without you having to go to every individual manager. Now, sometimes you do need to set that up. Okay. There's some special things that if it doesn't work out in Central, they still have the management backup. But some things are a little bit tricky when you start to do something like that as well. Okay.
Yeah, and so you could go into the UCS manager to get, it's almost like a little bit deeper into the levels, kind of top up here in the manager, and then if you need to, you can go into the manager to get into some of the fine tunings if needed.
Right. So, for example, since we do have a few minutes here, let me go ahead and set up at least one thing, which I just need to make sure I actually set up the proper information here. That's what I'm trying to make sure I get to, which are the details behind what I actually need, which is going to be setting up a registration here. Okay. So when we start to take a look at the idea here, remember I told you that UCM1 is missing. So if I do 198.18.133.91, I have a username, which is admin, and then my super secret password. So here I'm just trying to make sure you can see what I'm typing in, right? Now, normally you want to do this by domain name, in other words, using DNS names, because IP addresses can change. In my demo environment, DNS isn't set up, so that's why I'm using this. And then you, of course, can actually say which one you're actually going to choose and select. We're using this UCS Central 1 is what we're going to choose. At that point, I can select Register. And here in a moment, you'll see, there it is. The configuration is already in progress, as you see right there. And then if I want to actually watch the status, I can click on the status itself. And you can see that it's already checked authorizing admin credentials. Let me see if I can zoom in. Remote domain registration, push, it's shared secret. Now it's checking and see if the status is actually working. And it's currently in progress up at the top. 73% in progress at this point. Okay, so there's a lot that you can actually do. And Vaughn, this means I didn't have to go into the UCSM1 to make this all happen. As long as it's actually within my reach that I can actually make that work, given the actual proper passwords and given the names, I can now pull it underneath my UCS Central administrative domain and begin to apply policies. I'm getting 100% and showing success now, okay, of everything. Let me close this out. And now there it is. It is now registered And Vaughn, if it's registered, just like all those other domains were registered, let me see if I can go back here for a moment. Of course not, okay? So if we go back in, there we go. Got to get on the right tab here, okay? We go back in, that means I can apply policies across all of these, okay, that I need to and do what else needs to happen, okay? Just kind of realize there's a lot that's actually here. So depending on your need, if you're actually managing more than one manager, okay? In other words, you're actually responsible for more than one particular domain management. UCS Central is pretty much the way to go. If you're really in a small environment and you're only managing one, the UCS manager itself is probably going to be your friend to do so. So Vaughn, in these 2 episodes that we've kind of grouped together underneath the whole idea of our cloud compute so far, where we've talked about the Cisco specific hardware, which of course is the UCS components itself, and now also the software, you can see why they combined this all together under the term UCS, Unified Computing System, because it is the combination of the hardware and software working together that makes it such an efficient system. And I said this kind of weird thing at the beginning of the previous episode here, Vaughn, that Cisco is normally known for their hardware, and most everybody kind of looks at the software and goes, man, you kind of really didn't put more effort into it than you need to. But as far as this idea of the UCS management itself, it is probably one of their best developed pieces of software that they have out there, and it works really well, okay? So it's something that's actually a consideration, but to tell you the truth, right, as much as this is great, okay, and everything, more than likely today is outpaced by the actual public cloud providers, okay? And I don't mean that to knock Cisco. It's a great product, okay? But they are competing in a space of giants at this point. And so unless your company is really dedicated to that hybrid environment and going full Cisco, you're probably not going to see a ton of it in the real world unless you go to a truly all Cisco shop. And again, they're still out there, but it may not actually be the one that you'll probably be working in. But just kind of be aware, especially if you're getting ready for this exam. So Vaughn, that's actually a good place for us to wrap this episode up, as we've now actually gone over the hardware and the software components inside of the UCS itself.
All right. Well, thank you so much for all that great information, Ronnie, and thank you for joining us. But we are going to go ahead and sign off for IT Pro TV. I've been your host, Vaughn Smith.
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
We'll see you soon.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.